choice is one about how to bring key stakeholders to the table for purposes of beginning conversations about occupational licensing reform. And I know that our friends at NELPA put together an award-winning panel on that session as well. And finally, a third area that is very near and dear to my heart, which is criminal court debt, which is another collateral consequence people face once the time is done and the probation is done, and still the consequences of having a record goes on. And we have people doing some of the most exceptional work in the country for that panel as well. So hey, it's a difficult choice. What can I say? I'm reminded of when we had this conference in the past and people would come to me and say, why do you make such good sessions? I want to go to all of them. So let me take a quick poll to see who might be going where. Who thinks you might be going to the expungement aftercare session? This is for the wonks in the room. All right. Okay, and who thinks you will go to the key stakeholders in licensing barrier session? And finally, who is going to go to hear about court debt? Good representation on all topics. Thank you very much. Okay, and with no further ado then, I will turn it over to the last plenary of the day and introduce you to Jared Bernstein, who is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget.
Well, thank you very much. We have a great panel here, and I am going to say a few introductory remarks before I introduce them, and then we're going to have a conversation as opposed to having each panelist present. And we're going to try to keep it kind of crisp because we'd really like to engage with you. I know that this audience wants to engage with us, and we're going to make sure we leave time for that to happen. We're going to talk more about some of the research that's going on, but as audience members, I'd like to ask you, as you're listening to us, to think about ways in which that research can help you in your practice as practitioners and holes in the research that are missing and that folks like those up here on the dais with me could maybe fill. Just a little bit of background about how I came to be here and why I'm moderating this panel. I'm an economist, and my work in recent years has focused on largely the macroeconomy, thinking about ways in which we can generate the kinds of overall economic conditions that are most welcoming to the least advantaged. And so I think a lot about full employment and fiscal policy and monetary policy and all of that, and write these sort of gnarly papers about macroeconomics. So the central goal of my work is to achieve full employment in the U.S. labor market, where the number of jobs and the number of job seekers is very tightly matched up. So all of this may sound somewhat far afield, except it occurred to me fairly early on that we were never going to achieve full employment in this country without a strategy for criminal justice and criminal justice reform. There are just too many tens of millions of people who face the kinds of barriers that you're about to hear about and that you know well about, who are unable to access the labor market in ways that have implications not just for them and their own well-being and livelihoods, but as Rachel's work has shown, have generational impacts. So with that, let me thank Rebecca Vallis, who was instrumental in putting the panel together, and introduce Rachel West, who's the Associate Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at CAP. Alan Barber is the Director of Domestic Policy at the Center for Economic Policy Research, and his work has focused on labor markets, kind of the nexus between labor markets and incarceration. Chris Henrichson, right here, serves as Research Director of the Vera Institute of Justice, where he specializes in cost-benefit analysis and some of the kinds of cost issues that we were just hearing about from the podium. And my colleague, Mike Mitchell, with whom I've played basketball, well, he's played basketball and I've hobbled around watching him, is a colleague of mine at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So let's jump in with a question for you to get us started, Rachel. Your work focuses on the kinds of barriers that individuals with criminal records place and some of the generational reverberations those barriers engender. Tell us first a little bit about what you found, and I'm going to give all of the panelists this instruction. It'd be helpful if you would focus on the kinds of interventions that you think are needed to overcome those barriers as well.
So first off, let me start off and say Jared may not be a great basketball player in his own words, but we hear he's a great bassist, and if you can find my colleague Marlene, she apparently has great recording of him playing at a block party the other day. Very talented musician.
So Saturday night there was a block party, and I walk in today, and the first thing I see is Marguerite, who was at the block party, so I'm like, worlds collide.
Bob Marley, I hear. Yes, so we've done a lot of research at CAP, headed up by my colleague Rebecca, whom you've heard a lot from today, about the intersection between criminal records and poverty and economic inequality. And it will be absolutely no surprise to anyone here that we know that there is a strong link between the three and that causation runs in both directions. So just to talk a little bit about that, there's research, for example, that you'll find in your packet that statistics like the fact that the finding that the poverty rate would be 20% lower today, 8.1 million fewer people in poverty, if not for mass incarceration. Research by folks like Bruce Western and Becky Pettit that have found that being incarcerated seriously hampers one's social mobility and is more likely than any other sort of the main disadvantages we see, educational or income related, to keep folks in the bottom 20% of the earnings distribution, even 20 years out of prison. And then also research that shows that there's another direction of causation running from poverty to imprisonment as well, and that the more economic opportunity people have, the less they have to resort to activities that are deemed by our justice system to be criminal. And so the Council of Economic Advisors, when I believe Jared was in the White House, did work leveraging this research to show that, for example, raising the minimum wage to $12 an hour by 2020 would, through reducing criminal activity, have social benefits on the order of $8 billion to $17 billion for taxpayers. So there's two directions of causation there. Well, I think less research has been done about the folks with records who have not been formerly incarcerated. They're 9 times the size or more as a population than those who are formerly incarcerated. But we know very little about them in terms of the data. Yet we are able to show, and CAPS has a couple of reports, notably One Strike and You're Out, that the barriers presented to employment, to housing stability, to education, to financial and economic security are such that we can see clearly in the evidence that a criminal record can truly be a life sentence to poverty. But one thing that I hope this panel will call for is greater research on that set of folks so we can make the case to policymakers that this is so. So
suppose we were able to make that case and policymakers still said, okay, I'm convinced that the barriers you've talked about are truly tall and hard to get over, but employers, landlords, they have a right, they have a right to know about people with criminal records. How do you square, especially if there's public safety involved or something, how do you square that kind of, that view with the kinds of proposals that I think you're thinking about in order to overcome these barriers? Mm-hmm.
So I think it's got to be a sort of both-and strategy of policies that are ostensibly not related to criminal justice, perhaps. That's policies that raise wages, like expanding the earned income tax credit, raising the minimum wage, but then also speaking to constituent groups on their own terms. Not to signal out our background checker once again, but in the last panel, Representative Rochester pointed out that working with employers and working with folks who are in industry in order to get their buy-in when you're talking to employers and landlords, college admissions boards who check backgrounds at very high rates. We need the buy-in of all of these stakeholders to say we're willing to cede our right to information if we can be perhaps it's protection in other ways, or perhaps it's just leveling the playing field across employers rather than having them voluntarily give up checking backgrounds.
Yeah, I think one thing I was thinking of as you were speaking was this idea that as the job market is tighter, and if it gets hot enough where it's actually employers have somewhat less leeway to discriminate, because it's a matter of whether you hire someone who otherwise you might discriminate against, or you leave profit on the table. So there's a complementarity there between kind of the overall tautness of the job market and employers' willingness to go outside their comfort zone. Which actually brings me to Alan's work. Alan, your work has focused, Rachel was talking about minimum wages, EITC, and obviously we're strong advocates of those. By the way, here's something you probably haven't heard. I just heard that Lindsey Graham, so Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, suggested that the tax cut should be paired with a minimum wage increase, which is a weird idea, but whatever. Let's throw that out there. Alan.
Don't ask me about that.
Yeah, I won't ask you about that. I myself can't explain that.
All right.
But your work is, so these ideas, minimum wage, EITC, very good ideas, but you have to have a job for you to have any earnings. And so I'd like you to talk about some of the employment results that you found looking at folks both with imprisonment backgrounds, with felony convictions, and so on.
Sure, and first off, thanks for having me on this panel. I want to thank Rebecca as well for organizing this panel. It's great to see so many people here today who are concerned with this work, and I'm glad to be able to contribute in some way. So in terms of the work that we've done at CEPR, we decided that we wanted to focus on working age populations of people who had been in prison or who had a felony conviction. And what we wanted to do there is look at the employment effects, the labor market effects on these groups of people. So what we did after estimating the size of this population, we found at the end that being incarcerated or having a felony conviction lowered the employment rate of lowered the overall employment rate by a full percentage point. That's important because Jared was talking about full employment a few minutes ago. And we all know that the closer the economy gets to full employment, the better it is for everyone. Being closer to full employment increases workers' bargaining rights. It increases income. And the fact that you're lowering the employment rate by a full percentage point is detrimental to the communities of people who have criminal records.
Al, let me clarify one thing. Sure. That 1 percentage point is the overall employment rate for the whole economy. It's larger if you just look at subgroups, right?
Oh, exactly,
Okay,
exactly.
keep going. Sorry.
And if you look at subgroups, it is considerably larger. If you look at Black Americans, you'll see that it decreases the employment rates from 2.3% to 4.7 percentage points. For people without a high school education, that goes from 3.2 percentage points to 8.1 percentage points. Those are very dramatic numbers, and I think they're even more dramatic when you look at the fact that for whites, there was only a decrease of about, for white men in particular, there was only a decrease of 0.4 percentage points to 1.1 percentage points. I bring that point up because I think it gets to one of Jared's questions about what we can do here to change the effects of barriers to employment. And I think this result in particular points out a difference in probably sentencing disparities, because you'll see here that if the employment rate is lowered considerably for blacks versus for whites who have the same convictions, that has to be a problem somewhere, and that's likely to lie with sentencing.
So there's an intersection here between what you're describing about and discrimination and great difficulty in unpacking the two. But I was just thinking of, if you look at the unemployment rate. So one of the things I encounter in my work is people say, if only everybody would just get more education, we'd all be fine. And I think it'd be great for people to get more education, but we wouldn't all be fine. Mm-hmm. And one way you can look at that is by just looking at the unemployment rates by race and by education. And it's a well-known thing that the black unemployment rate is just, always twice the white unemployment rate. And yet that ratio persists across education groups. So it's actually just about the same ratio for college grads as it is for high school dropouts, that ratio of 2 to 1. In your work, how do you think about the interaction between discrimination and criminal justice in this labor market space?
I think the interaction is, again, most evident from our research in the disparities between the employment levels. But, I mean, that's a really tough question, and I may be a little stumped.
Well, think about it, and we'll get back to you. But to keep things moving here, and I appreciate Alan and Rachel being crisp so far, I actually wanted to go to you next, Michael, because I think your work hitchhikes off of Alan's in a useful way in the following sense. You've written a lot about we're centered on budget and policy priorities, so you've written a lot about the budgetary implications of the kinds of increases in incarceration that Alan was just talking about. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was looking at your work and preparing for the panel is that, so I want you to first talk about your findings, right. But I also want you to then talk about the following. So we're now in a place where states are all scrounging around for money, and you actually have some bipartisan energy around spending less on incarceration for smart reasons. And I guess I'd like to hear you hold forth a little bit about whether there is any politics there for getting something done, probably at the subnational level, in ways that you might not expect in areas that we care about.
Sure. So first, some of the work that as Jared kind of alluded to, that we've been looking into is asking the question of how much states are just spending overall in incarceration, and what are some of the opportunity costs, not necessarily human opportunity costs, but the consequences for state budgets. So right now, states are spending, just at the state level, so this is not local dollars, but just at the state level, about $52 billion on corrections. That's about 7% of state budgets, which some folks might say, well, 7% is not a lot, but $52 billion is a significant amount of resources that if you targeted it to the same communities that we're targeting, that we're choosing to send and lock up, and actually put those dollars into the kinds of investments that would help communities and bolster local economies, you would see drastically different outcomes. And so a lot of our work has been very much in the weeds around the fiscal aspects of saying, okay, here are some of the mechanisms that you can put in place to make sure that when you start to engage in certain reforms, that those dollars get protected, that they don't just get reabsorbed back into state budgets, to make sure that there's actual oversight over some of these types of things so that those dollars aren't actually just reinvested back into, say, more policing or more oversight or into other aspects of the criminal justice system, but they're actually going to things in the communities that folks in those communities want them invested in. So, it's been a really interesting past few years because since the recession, states have been very aggressive in trying to find ways that they can save money in the ways that they spend. Now, at the same time, we've also seen a lot of states engage in some very reckless tax cutting. But across the board, what we've seen are states trying to get smarter on how they invest their resources. And there has been this emergence of kind of bipartisanship on some level to look at ways to spend smarter, to to legislate smarter on criminal justice reform. There is a broad and growing concern that, as I was just saying, that a lot of that has led to more superficial changes, hasn't led to tackling some of the structural issues that are going on, and are really just being funneled back into the criminal justice system.
What are some of those structural issues?
Well, as I was saying, things that actually get to employment, things that actually help local communities grow. Are we investing in the human capital of folks? So if you were to tackle some of those issues and engage in real, honest conversations around structural racism and structural inequality, we could go much further in addressing this issue than we have so far. And I could go on about.
Well, I'd like to either now or if you want to think about it, I want to come back to you and, or you're welcome to answer now if it's at the top of your head. Is there a state that's doing this well in your view?
There are states that are doing aspects of this well. I lived up Prop 47 in California in some ways. I think that was an interesting. So Prop 47 pushed a lot of things that were considered felonies to misdemeanors, so reclassifying, and it allowed it to be retroactive, so folks could actually that are incarcerated could apply to get their sentences adjusted, and it included in the legislative language the creation of this reinvestment fund. So on an annual basis, the state is calculating how much they're saving from these reforms. Those dollars are kind of saved in this fund and then sent out to be invested in various things around education for at-risk youth, a little bit of money for victim services, and then some other dollars for local kind of mental health and substance abuse programming. So that is good in structure, but then there have been issues in California around making sure that those annual estimates are honest and making sure that the amount of money that was originally estimated to be saved is actually making it to local communities and what it's being invested in. So we're seeing pieces that are good. Interesting. But it's not, if you look kind of across the board, there's a lot of work to be done.
This complements your work nicely, Chris, in my mind in the following sense. We understand the costs as Mike just outlined them, but there are deeper costs as well, opportunity costs for people who, generational costs like Rachel has documented. And you've done some really interesting work on the cost and benefits of criminalization and criminal justice. And one of the phrases in your work that I was struck by is the criminalization of poverty. It just resonated with me. So I'd like you to talk about your cost-benefit analysis, but also weave in your thoughts about this notion of a criminalization of poverty that's occurring in this space.
Great, thank you, and thank you again, Rebecca. And it's wonderful to be here. I will do that. I do want to comment on one thing about Michael's work before I get into that, because it ties so closely to something that we're doing at Vera, which is also, we're spending a lot of time looking at prison costs. And maybe surprisingly, but prison costs are actually declining in many states. California is not one of them, notwithstanding the enormous population decline. And we're spending a lot of time taking a careful look at these cost trajectories, just for the reasons that Michael was saying. It's important that the taxpayers and advocates hold the feet to the fire of the legislators to make sure that they're actually downsizing on their prison systems. And there needs to be that mechanism that Michael mentioned with respect to Prop 47, but without sort of a sustained effort to keep our eye on budgets, the budgets are going to stagnate. And certainly, they will not shrink as quickly as they grew. But our work at Vera extends beyond just the dollars and cents, and we do cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis for those that take CBA in graduate school learn that it's all-encompassing. It's not just about budget savings and budget costs. It's about human costs and societal costs and societal benefits and human costs. And that's obviously difficult analytically, but it's not impossible. And so we really do the best we can to sort of bring that tool to bear when studying social policy and criminal justice reform. So I think one good example is that when we examined a program called the Center of Employment Opportunities that many in this room know about, our reentry program, we didn't just take a look at the reduction in recidivism, which is sort of a calling card of all criminal justice research, to see how many fewer people go back into prison and jail and measure the taxpayer savings attendant to that, but also take a look at how much more are the people in that program earning on average, and putting that into the analysis as well, just critical. When we took a look at raising the age of juvenile jurisdiction in North Carolina, we didn't just take a look at the reductions in recidivism and how that would affect taxpayer budgets, but in that case it was leveraging the work such as Alan's to say, well, if these young people aren't being convicted with the felony, and if but for that they would be making X amount more for their lifetime. And we found that that was actually a very compelling argument analytically to both sides of the aisle in North Carolina, and one that, notwithstanding where someone in that legislative task force fell on where they voted for the bill, that reasoning and those analytics made perfect sense.
What do you mean when you write about the criminalization of poverty?
I cheated. I didn't answer the question.
I do that, but you're not supposed to do that.
So right now, Vera's doing a lot of work with jails, and we're finding that the vast majority of people that cycle through jails, to be sure, and a good number of those that remain in jail for some period, are very poor. And the jury's still out on why pretrial detention has risen as fast as it has and faster than prison populations, but many signals seem to be pointing to bail, which since the 1990s has become more prevalent and more expensive. We recently did a study in New Orleans, which is a very big user of bail. They're a city that uses commercial bail very heavily, meaning that the practices for if you can't afford bail, which is most people in this context, you go to a commercial bond agent who pays for your bail, and you pay 10% of that cost, and you don't get any back. The consequence of it is that you have a system where just because you're arrested means you immediately owe money out of pocket that is not refundable. And for the very many people that cannot afford that, even 10%, they stay in jail. And so, of course, bail is least affordable the more expensive it is, but even there's sort of a bit of a paradox in that most people in jail in New Orleans held on bail are there on lower bail, because whether it's $500 or $5,000 or $50,000, it's all kind of the same. And this is a case where sort of cost benefit was a useful tool, because when doing the study we could point to the city and say 3 out of 10 people in the jail are there just because they couldn't afford their bail. And you're actually paying more, even on the margins, to house these people in jail than you would have received from the bail fee that they would have remitted to the city.
If I may pick
Please.
up on that for a second, one thing that just really strikes me about all aspects of the criminal justice research and literature is this notion of just really vicious cycles, like you were just talking about, from bail to debt to poverty. And one that we've studied in the same vein is looking out over a longer term than we do often in shorter term benefit cost analyses, but looking at the multi-generational aspects that you alluded to, Jared, of criminal records, and not just former incarceration, but a parental record on children and families. And one thing that I really want to emphasize, I think the community sort of lacks, is good data on who has a record and how that is impacting their family and their children. So one thing that we took a stab at, but that I would love to see future research refine, is estimating the number of children in the US, minor children whose parent has a criminal record. And so we embarked on this research a couple of years ago, and using some survey data that isn't perfect, but we came to the conclusion that it's just short of half of children in this country under the age of 18 have a parent with a criminal record. And so we're really hampering, when you think about the consequences for children growing up with a parent who has barriers to employment or to steady housing or to getting public assistance like food stamps or TANF. You're really just hobbling an entire generation. And then mixing that with the fact that we are soon going to be a majority-minority nation, and that half of the children born today are children of color, and that our justice system targets black and brown folks to a much greater extent than white folks, we are hampering a future generation of workers, to speak to the economists on the panel, with all kinds of adverse consequences from the very start.
So that seems like a good connection back to your work, Alan. Let's move to each of us doing what we've already kind of been doing, is talking about ideas you think would help knock down barriers in your particular space. So in your work on the job market and the difficulties that people with criminal records have in that regard, what about ban the box? Is that, you know, how big a deal should we be making of that? How helpful in your mind do you think that that is?
I think that ban the box as a policy would have a positive effect. There are some studies out there. There was a recent study, I believe in 2016, that pointed to a negative impact. However, I believe some folks at EPI, speaking of research that could be done that we'd all be interested in, some folks at EPI are thinking about looking at the results of that study to see what type of impact ban the box practices have in communities. And I think it'd have a tremendous effect. If you look at the sheer number of black people who have a felony conviction and the barriers that they face, the fact that they will not be able to find employment, if you couple in the idea that, you know, looking to other research like the work of, say, Sandy Darity or Derek Hamilton that points to a lack of generational wealth accumulation, I think that if you had a policy, like if you had more prevalent ban the box policies, you'd see, in fact, that you did see a decline in the number of people who were barred from the labor force.
Michael, I was in Colorado recently in Denver actually, talking to the chief economist of the state, and he was talking about the revenues they've collected through legalization of pot. Different issue, but they were very pleased by their revenue collections, which had been greater than they had projected. And one of the things that he described was happening was other states are paying attention to that and recognizing that, you know, costs and benefits, but it's something we should probably be looking at from the perspective of our fiscal conditions. Is there something, you talked about this a little bit in the context of California, is there a research, a body of work that needs to be done to kind of point the way for states who may be reluctant for ideological reasons or discriminatory reasons to go down the sort of paths that I think your work implies? Does that exist? Should it exist? What are your thoughts on that?
So I might not be understanding the question perfectly well, but there is a strong body of work already to show that public investment in some of the things I was talking about, infrastructure investments, education, items like cleaning up polluted environments and providing access to better healthcare, these things help grow economies. You know, these kinds of investments are good.
I mean, specifically what I was trying to get at was, are there states that have done stuff like that such that other states need to know about it, because maybe they would if we put that information in front of them?
Sure. So, I mean, high level, there are states that have made decisions around, say, expanding Medicaid. Minnesota has done some great things around investing in education and making the decision to raise taxes to fund investments in education, and some of that was around community and higher education as well. So states are making some of those decisions piece by piece, and I think in this conversation there is a connection that folks can make between corrections budgets and these things at the local level, right? They can say, look, you're spending X million dollars every year on this. You take some of those resources and put into these same communities. And there was a thing, there's this kind of idea around called $1 million blocks, where essentially you can go into just a simple block in a neighborhood, and the state is spending, you know, millions of dollars and incarcerating folks from that neighborhood. Right. Well, if you just turn that around and from day one put those same level of resources into these neighborhoods, into that block, you would have a world of different outcomes. It's not, and the truth is that's happening in some communities. Predominantly white communities are getting those kinds of investments and resources, and then predominantly black and brown communities are not.
Yeah.
And that's not a coincidence. And so in terms of other solutions, you know, that's one of the things I'm going to always point to is the level of investment that we're putting into specific communities and neighborhoods. I think that even within kind of the realm of criminal justice, state spending on public defenders and indigent defense is another critical area that we need to be talking about. You know, there was a recent book by researcher John Pfaff, Locked In, that did a really good highlighting of kind of the lack of investment that we've put into indigent defense in this country and the growing problem that means for individuals having their constitutional rights to counsel. And by states actively choosing to fund tax cuts or to not fund these things, they're sentencing folks really before they have an opportunity to make their case. So it's another area.
Let me connect that a little bit to current events, and then I'm going to ask Chris one last question and then open it up to the audience. So we're debating this big tax cut now, and folks like us and CAP and others are trying to push back hard against this wasteful, regressive idea of cutting taxes, particularly for those at the top of the scale. The estate tax, the corporate tax, a bunch of new loopholes. So just a terrible idea. And we sort of rail against this from the perspective of, you know, the wealthy are already doing great. Do they really need a tax cut, which is, you know, a powerful and true argument. But there's another side of this, which is that since this tax cut will never pay for itself, it's going to make the deficit worse. And then you're not going to have conservatives or even Democrats stand up and say, well, we clearly made a mistake, now we have to raise taxes. They're going to cut spending. And so it's, there are a lot of federal spending programs that filter down to the kinds of spending that you're talking about. And one of the things we've tried to do at the center is emphasize this NDD part of the budget, non-defense discretionary, because that's where a lot of that lives, and it's already at really historical lows. And that's, I think that kind of a national budget perspective is actually really important if we're going to be able to make the kinds of investments you're talking about. Now, as you suggested, states can and do that themselves, but a lot of those resources do flow from the feds. Final comment before we go to Q&A, and you're welcome to reflect on anything we've been talking about, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the benefit side of the equation, so costs and benefits. Has your work uncovered some benefits to alternative kinds of criminal justice policies that are, you know, less punitive, such that we can argue a set of benefits that maybe we're not talking about enough?
Sure. Then I'm going to go back and answer your question for your friend in Colorado, or at least my perspective.
Sure.
Well, the answer to your question is in large part why cost-benefit analysis is kind of even on the agenda for this session and has been for many sessions like this for the past 5 to 10 years. It's because just about everything is more cost-effective than sending people to prison and jail. And so even programs that have positive but relatively small impacts over time accrue benefits when compared to the status quo. Right now, a lot of our work, my work personally, is focused on working with local jurisdictions. There's growing interest in diversion at really every point. So from arrest, there's increasing interest in a program called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. You know, let's not arrest the person, let's do something else. Prosecutors are increasingly sort of getting on this train and thinking through, well, I can decline to prosecute and do X instead of Y. Oftentimes in those offices, no surprise, that accrues savings, not just in the justice system writ large, but also within the prosecutor's office. And really the beginnings of this work, this work being sort of alternatives to incarceration, was sort of centered around diversions to prisons and reentry programs that had been sort of known to reduce recidivism. Really a whole slate of research that had been done comparing programs in X versus the status quo, which inevitably finds oftentimes lower rates of recidivism. And that's all well and good, but I am also reminded of, we had a research speaker at Vera not that long ago, and I'm sure for those of you who aren't in sort of in the world of therapy, there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's one of those, many programs have been found to, routinely accrue benefits in excess of its costs, and the speaker's call is, we can't CBT our way out of mass incarceration, and that's absolutely true. We can't be just thinking about these diversionary type efforts. So I guess the answer to your friend in Colorado, he's going to get a windfall, as well many states, which is a blessing. It's also sometimes a curse when you're sort of directing your public policy in pursuit of dollars. But I don't know much about sort of tobacco trust funds, but I wonder if there's some analog there. If marijuana use presents externalities in sort of the economist lexicon, and so there's an opportunity to invest in drug treatment where there's no greater time than now for drug treatment. So much of the need is in places that at the local level that from the start don't have resources compared to states and certainly the feds, and especially now more, it's rural areas that are hurting the most and have no tax base, never had, and really need investment, and there's an opportunity for state investment.
All right, thank you. Let's go to the audience, please. And is there a microphone? Oh, yeah, okay, so we have a microphone, and there's a question in the back.
Josh Ho, Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency and Nation Outside. So recently, one of the more innovative things I've seen is the stuff that the Brennan Foundation has been doing around outcome-based, like the End Mass Incarceration Act, outcome-based and success-based budgeting for DOCs and for state budgeting of incarceration. Did you all have any thoughts about that or that kind of approach?
Anyone? Michael? Rachel, Michael?
I don't feel qualified to speak to that since I'm not fully aware of the policy.
So I could jump in. So the Brennan Center, and I imagine this is what you're leading to for years, has been pushing everyone and the federal government in particular to rethink how they make decisions about their funding, and with a special eye towards the BERN-JAG grant funding, which historically has been allocated to a host of justice agencies, but mostly law enforcement. And their performance metrics has been encouraging the field to rethink how they allocate those dollars so that they're not perennially allocating them to law enforcement, i.e. putting them to a system that's going to arrest more people and send them to the system as opposed to divert them. So getting them to think about what the evidence says as they're before they allocate the dollars. The difficulties, of course, there's a large set of stakeholders that are very vested in the way the current BERN-JAG scheme works. So the Brennan idea is a good one. It's based on sound principles, but it's going to be met with opposition, even by well-meaning stakeholders.
And there might also be issues just of magnitude of the dollars versus the state's kind of own decisions around what they want to do in terms of their state policy. So while it's important and it's a good question to ask, it's also as within a state, is it something that completely shifts the tide? And most likely in many states it's not. So it's good policy, but it's something that needs to be a part of a more holistic approach in any state.
Another question right there, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you very much for this panel. My name is Andrew Bradley. I'm with the Indiana Institute for Working Families. I'm just interested to hear from folks on the panel about what the state of research is about not just educational attainment, but also like credential and occupational skill levels of folks with records and incarceration. I'm thinking about how that could be shown to folks in my state who might be concerned about the skills mismatch and that kind of thing, and how much, where we could direct retraining opportunities, and also just how our labor market's missing out.
Great question. Alan, you want to start with that?
Sure, I'll jump in quickly. I'll say there's two things that have to be considered here, I think. One is the types of jobs that people can have once they leave prison. And given the concerns around licensure, barriers to licensure in certain occupations, folks in prison don't have the opportunity to train for those jobs because there's an understanding that they won't have them when they leave. So one place we might want to start is looking at changing the licensure practices. I don't know of any work that CEPR's done that looks particularly at the issue of retraining. I know that CAP recently, I believe you recently had a piece that looked at retraining and looked at apprenticeships as a possibility. I don't know if that's something you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, so I believe my colleague Angela Hanks, with some consultation with Rebecca, put together a piece on apprenticeships for folks who are re-entrants. So I think that is, and I'm not sure, I can't speak to the full state of the research evidence on that, but it's something that I believe states are trying and then more should be trying. So that's one way to automatically funnel folks through apprenticeships into employment. I think another place to look for support for the type of credentialing. Again, there's this issue of a massive issue that you'll talk about in one of the breakout sessions next on licensure and the many pitfalls that vary a lot across states in who can and can't have access to those jobs. So there's an active, and I think we'll see even more activity around lifting some of those that arguably have nothing to do with health or safety needs. But another couple things that I wanted to mention, add to your arsenal the evidence on correctional education, where I think the benefits just purely in terms of reduced recidivism are just really evident. Like a RAND study found a 43% drop in recidivism for folks who had completed correctional education. Academic and vocational have slightly different effects. Vocational seems to be where the big effects are, even more so than academic education while in prison. And then finally, something that just a plug for Jared's work that he's done that crosses various disadvantaged populations, and CAP has done some work on it as well. States where there are subsidized employment options, like we saw in the aftermath of the Great Recession, really have good success with that and can really help folks get into jobs and help employers understand that there are serious benefits to hiring them.
Yeah, I was going to just make a comment about that. I don't think we solved the problem that we face here on barriers to employment. These are all great ideas, and we should do them. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we solve this problem without some kind of a direct employment program. They exist on a continuum, subsidized jobs to private employers. That's what Rachel was talking about. We've actually done that, and it's worked pretty well. All the way to direct job creation, where the private sector or the public sector actually creates employment for people. My experience is that take any unemployment rate you want, 4%, 3.5%. At that point, the Fed starts freaking out. But put that aside for a second. Even at that low an unemployment rate, we'd still have folks who would need some sort of subsidized employment, not forever, by the way, but to cross the barrier into the job market. Sorry, you're next.
All right. So I'm Beth Johnson. I'm from Chicago, from Cabrini Green Legal Aid. We do a lot of records.
You sound like you're from Chicago.
So I had a question to follow up on your comment, Michael. And mind you, we're from a state where budget is not the gold standard for the United States of America.
Let's hope not.
We often hear that, right? Let's redirect money from what we're spending on corrections and put it back into communities, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem is it doesn't seem to go beyond a talking point. Right. Like there's not a blueprint to actually do that, right? There's many dimensions to this, and I get that. And so you mentioned there's some good work that has been done in certain places. Yeah. Are there case studies? Is there more detail that we can use to move beyond a talking point? Because it's like a security deposit. You can't get a new place. You have to double down on your rent for a month or two, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's what, I mean, to help advocates actually move legislators to do something?
Yeah,
Great
so
question.
this is a very, very, very different population, and I want to stress that. But on the youth justice side, we have seen some. Well, one, we've seen kind of youth incarceration levels falling for a pretty significant period of time, and so you have a lot of states that have these facilities at the state level that are, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to lock up kids. And advocates have come into this space to say, you could close these facilities, provide supports at the community level, save a ton of money, and actually have better outcomes for these kids, as we've kind of mentioned earlier. And we have seen in some places, Kansas is an interesting example from a couple years ago, where they were able to put in place some reforms. They're going to close one of their state facilities, and they've put in place the mechanisms to save that money and to build out a kind of a continuum of community-based approaches. I bring up Kansas also because it is another state that has made a pretty bad fiscal mess in the past few years, and in a place where lawmakers are always looking for resources that they can use to plug holes. Advocates were able to go there and to really push for savings being redirected to those community-based approaches. And last year, this past year, as the state was kind of struggling with another kind of budget shortfall, advocates were able to defend that money and to make sure that it wasn't raided. So there are some examples. We can continue to talk about that, but it is a difficult. That is the game. That is the difficult aspect of this is to get the reforms in place, to get some kind of mechanisms in law that protect those savings, and then the hard work year to year of holding lawmakers accountable to make sure that it goes where it's supposed to go. And that is a difficult task. I'm going to let Alan weigh in on that answer for a second, but we have to stop now. I noticed that there was at least a question or two that I didn't get to. So please come up and I'll ask my panelists if they don't mind just chilling for a minute and addressing people who can come up to us afterwards. But you get the last word on that question.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Real briefly, before Vera, I was at the New York City Budget Office, and I think the New York State had a good mechanism for child welfare preventive funding that I think might be worth thinking about. And so the problem with reinvestment is the state needs to decide how much and how to do it. But the way it worked with preventive funding in New York for child welfare prevention is it was open-ended and matching. And so it was incumbent on the local to say, okay, we're going to do these programs, and we're going to spend X amount on it, and we in law will get 2/3 reimbursement from the state. So all I got to do is just send you a claim to the Social Services Bureau. So all the work is done by the locals, but they get the money from the state rather than having to wait for the state to put out an RFP and do all of that.
Well, streamlined. All right, well, thank you very much.